August 9th, 1944. The early morning mist clung to the islands of the Mariana Archipelago, where the American air base on Tinian hummed with quiet, methodical activity. The first rays of sunlight sliced through the low clouds, glinting off the sleek fuselages of the B-29 Superfortresses lined up on the tarmac. Ground crews scurried like ants beneath the giant aircraft, making last-minute inspections of hydraulic lines, pressurized cabins, and the massive gleaming radial engines. Captain William Bill Henderson, a seasoned pilot of the 44th Bomb Group, climbed the ladder into the cockpit of B-29 Dauntless Lady, his fingers tracing the cold metal of the instrument panel. Sweat trickled down his temple despite the crisp morning air, a mix of nerves and anticipation tightening his chest. Today he and his crew would attempt something the Japanese defenders had thought impossible. A daylight bombing run over Tokyo from an airfield more than 1,500 miles away. In the distant horizon, the Pacific shimmered like molten silver. Henderson could hear the distant roar of other B-29 engines warming up, the vibrations reverberating through the tarmac. The scale of these planes was staggering, a wingspan of over 140 feet, capable of carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, and pressurized cabins, allowing crews to operate at altitudes the Japanese fighters could scarcely reach. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. As the last checks were made, the ground crews waved and shouted farewells, their voices swallowed by the rising drone of the engines. Henderson's co-pilot, Lieutenant James Foster, glanced at the altimeter and fuel gauges, double-checking each reading. "We're ready, Bill," he said, his voice steady but taut with adrenaline. And then, with a deep ground-shaking rumble, the Dauntless Lady lurched forward. Tires screeched, propellers whipped the humid air, and the Superfortress lifted gracefully into the sky. The crew felt the first surge of freedom as the island shrank beneath them, palm trees and airstrips reduced to miniature models. The Pacific stretched endlessly, a vast mirror reflecting the morning sun, while the distant outline of Japan loomed like a shadow on the horizon, still thousands of miles away. Inside the pressurized cabin, the air was crisp, almost sterile. Crew members adjusted oxygen masks, watched instruments and checked bomb bay readiness. Flight engineer Sergeant Carl Mendoza monitored engine pressures and fuel flow, his eyes darting from gauge to gauge. "Everything looks clean," he muttered, tension coiling in his voice. He knew that at 30,000 feet, there was no margin for error. One engine failure could spell disaster, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly airfield. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese radar operators squinted at blips moving higher and faster than any enemy aircraft they had encountered. Colonel Kenjiro Takahashi, commanding the air defense sector over Tokyo, barked orders into a crackling radio. "Scramble every interceptor. Identify that aircraft immediately." Yet, as his pilots took to the skies in their nimble Mitsubishi Zeros, they found themselves looking up at something they had never seen. The B-29s floated high above the clouds, nearly untouchable. Machine gun traces from the Zeros fell short, vaporizing harmlessly in the thin air, while the massive bombers glided with a serenity that belied the destruction they carried. For the Japanese, the appearance of the B-29 was nothing short of a revelation, a floating fortress, whose altitude, speed, and sheer size defied the capabilities of any aircraft they had deployed. And for the men aboard the Dauntless Lady, the first rays of dawn over the Pacific marked the beginning of a mission that would change the air war over Japan forever. Section 2. Into the heart of Japan, crossing an ocean of danger. The sun had climbed higher over the Mariana Islands, casting long shadows across the vast Pacific as the B-29 formation ascended steadily toward cruising altitude. Captain Henderson's voice crackled over the intercom. Calm but firm. Maintain course. Altitude 30,000. Eyes sharp. Flak could be anywhere. The flight stretched over 1,000 miles of open ocean. The endless blue below seemed to mock the pilots with its serenity, hiding the dangers that lay ahead. Henderson's mind wandered briefly to his family back home in Nebraska, to the wheat fields swaying under the summer wind, a world that seemed impossibly distant as he adjusted the throttles for maximum efficiency. Inside the dauntless lady, the crew moved like a well-oiled machine. Bombardier Lieutenant Robert Bobby Klein studied his northern bomb sight, calibrating it against the faint horizon line. "Accuracy is everything," he murmured. One miscalculation over Tokyo could mean missing the target, or worse, civilian casualties beyond what the mission intended. Sergeant Mendoza kept a close watch on engine temperatures. The B-29's four Wright R-3350 engines were marvels of engineering, but temperamental at extreme altitudes. A single malfunction could leave the aircraft stranded in hostile airspace. "All systems nominal," he reported, though the beads of sweat on his brow betrayed his underlying anxiety. Below, the Japanese defenses were beginning to stir. Radar blips hinted at the approach of multiple B-29 formations. Colonel Takahashi paced in the dim glow of the operations room. The map of Tokyo spread before him. "Altitude 30,000, they say," he muttered, incredulous. "Our Zeros cannot reach them. Our cannons are useless. How is this possible?" Back in the air, the first signs of the Japanese response came in the form of distant flak bursts. Tiny black puffs exploded harmlessly, far beneath the B-29s, each a reminder of the futility of traditional defenses at such heights. Henderson felt the slight tremor from a near-miss ripple through the fuselage, a subtle but sobering reminder that while the bombers were out of reach of small arms, the threat of organized defense was ever present. Crew morale wavered between tension and awe. Navigator Lieutenant Samuel Ito adjusted the course slightly, charting the most efficient path over the Pacific, factoring in wind patterns, jet streams, and the ever-looming threat of enemy interceptors. "We'll be over Honshu in 4 hours," he announced. The words carried weight. In 4 hours they would be above Tokyo, the epicenter of the Japanese war machine. As the flight pressed on, the scale and complexity of the B-29 became apparent even to the pilot. Pressurized cabins allowed them to operate without bulky oxygen suits, maintaining focus and stamina over long hours. Communications between planes, using the latest radio systems, kept the massive formation coordinated. Every detail mattered. One misstep could send a bomber spiraling into the Pacific below. Meanwhile, Japanese observers along the coastline glimpsed the enormous aircraft moving like phantom shadows in the thin morning haze. Reports poured into command posts. Massive planes cruising higher than any fighter could climb. Engines humming like distant thunder. The disbelief was palpable. For decades, Japan had relied on speed, maneuverability, and the element of surprise to dominate the air. Now, a new reality confronted them. They were facing a bomber that could fly circles around their defenses and strike the heart of the empire with impunity. Inside the dauntless lady, Lieutenant Klein adjusted the bomb sight for altitude, calculating drift and wind correction. Every adjustment brought them closer to the looming skyline of Tokyo. Outside, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a serene expanse belying the storm of destruction about to descend. The B-29's engines hummed in perfect unison, a symphony of technological marvel and human coordination. Henderson's eyes scanned the horizon, ever vigilant. Each passing mile over the ocean reinforced the extraordinary nature of the mission. Flying higher, farther, and with more destructive potential than anything the Japanese had ever encountered, the floating fortress lived up to its name. As the Japanese radar station scrambled jets in desperate pursuit, Henderson's crew remained calm, hearts pounding, but disciplined. Ahead lay enemy territory, anti-aircraft fire, and the ultimate test of both man and machine. The first real challenge of the mission, penetrating Japanese airspace without losing a single bomber, was fast approaching. Section 3. First Contact. The Japanese air defenders react. By late morning, the skyline of Honshu began to emerge from the haze, faint at first, then unmistakably detailed. Tokyo's sprawling cityscape stretched beneath them, rooftops gleaming in the high-altitude sun, rivers cutting silver lines through the urban sprawl. The crew of the Dauntless Lady peered through their oxygen masks and glass panels, scanning for signs of enemy resistance. It wasn't long before they received their first warning. Across the radio, the static-laden voice of a fellow bomber pilot reported, "Flak bursts, 10 o'clock high, appears light but increasing." Inside Tokyo, Colonel Kenjiro Takahashi's nerves were taut as piano wire reports from ground observers confirmed blips on radar, immense aircraft approaching from the south, flying at altitudes the Japanese fighters could barely hope to reach. "Scramble the interceptors," he barked, though even he doubted their chances. Mitsubishi Ki-61s and Ki-44s tore down runways, engines screaming as they attempted to climb, but each aircraft struggled against the thinning air and the towering altitude of the superfortresses. The first wave of Zeros and Hayabusas broke through the clouds, diving in desperate arcs toward the B-29s. Machine gun fire streaked upward in bright, fleeting lines, but the Japanese guns seemed almost impotent. Traces vanished before they could reach the pressurized cockpits. Henderson watched the distant flashes of anti-aircraft fire, the puffs of flak erupting far below them, harmless against the floating behemoth. Lieutenant Foster gripped his controls tightly, adrenaline surging. "They can't reach us," he muttered, almost in disbelief. The B-29's ceiling over 30,000 feet rendered the Japanese fighters largely ineffective. Even the heaviest ground-based flak struggled to make contact. The bomber floated like an indomitable fortress, massive and resolute, its silhouette cutting across the pale sky like a harbinger of destruction. Below, Japanese ground crews and radar operators watched in stunned silence. For decades, Japan had built its defenses around speed, precision, and altitude limitations. Nothing had prepared them for this. A bomber that flew higher, faster and farther than any fighter could intercept, pressurized cabins allowing crews to operate comfortably while carrying a payload massive enough to devastate the city below. Inside the Dauntless Lady, the crew began their meticulous preparations for the bombing run. Lieutenant Klein checked the bomb site again, calculating wind speeds and target drift. "Tokyo is within reach," he said softly, almost reverently. The city below, sprawling and oblivious, had never faced anything like this. Sergeant Mendoza monitored the engines, making subtle adjustments to compensate for turbulence at extreme altitude. Every motion was deliberate. There was no room for error. Crew members exchanged quick glances, a mixture of tension, awe, and grim determination. They knew that what they were witnessing, what they were participating in, would change the air war over Japan forever. The Japanese pilot's frustration mounted with each passing minute. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, leading a squadron of Ki-44s, found himself circling at maximum climb, engines screaming, struggling to close the distance. Each maneuver brought him tantalizingly close to the bomber's altitude, then farther away, the B-29 effortlessly climbing or adjusting course. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath. The word carried on the roar of the engines. Meanwhile, in the skies above Tokyo, Henderson's formation began lining up for the bombing run. The sun glinted off the aluminum fuselage, creating a blinding reflection that even the Japanese could not ignore. The city's defenders were witnessing the impossible, a machine engineered to dominate the skies, untouchable and precise, hovering like a steel colossus over their capital. For the first time, Japanese air commanders realized that a new era had arrived. Traditional tactics, nimble fighters and anti-aircraft cannons would no longer guarantee defense. The B-29 was more than a bomber. It was a psychological weapon, a floating fortress that instilled fear before it even released a single bomb. Inside the cockpit, Henderson exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. Ahead lay the most dangerous phase of the mission, the bombing run itself. But for now, the crew marveled at the sheer scale of what they were confronting. High above Tokyo, the B-29 had not just reached its target, It had stunned everyone in its path, friend and foe alike. Section 4. Bombs away. The Superfortress strikes Tokyo. The B-29 formation hovered above Tokyo like a silver phantom, engines humming with the confidence of invincibility. Below, the sprawling city looked peaceful, unaware of the storm about to descend from the sky. Captain Henderson's hand rested lightly on the throttle as he guided the dauntless lady into position. The precision of the approach was everything. Too early or too late, and the bombs could miss their target, or worse, the mission could fail. Bombardier report. Henderson called, voice calm but carrying the weight of command. Lieutenant Klein peered through the northern bomb sight, adjusting for wind drift and altitude. Target in sight. 500 yards off, course correction. Ready on your mark, Captain, he replied, fingers steady on the release lever. Outside, the first flak bursts began to erupt below them, black puffs of smoke rising against the sky, but at this altitude they were mere specks, harmless against the massive aluminum hull. Henderson watched the city spread out beneath him, rooftops and streets forming a sprawling grid. The sheer scale of Tokyo was overwhelming, and yet the Superfortress was higher than any interceptor, faster than the defenses could manage, and more powerful than anything Japan had faced before. With a quiet click, the bomb bay doors swung open, revealing rows of destructive payloads gleaming in the sunlight. For the crew it was a moment of tense anticipation. Time seemed to stretch, as Klein's voice cut through the intercom. Bombs away in 3, 2, 1. The first salvo dropped, plummeting like meteors from the high-altitude bomber. Explosions rippled through the streets below, sending smoke and fire twisting into the sky. Henderson felt a fleeting pang of awe. The destructive power of the aircraft was almost surreal, like watching a living embodiment of industrial might, unleashed with surgical precision. Below, Japanese civilians and defenders scrambled in panic. Anti-aircraft crews fired relentlessly, but their shells detonated far below the cruising altitude of the B-29s. Fighters attempted desperate dives, engines screaming as they closed in, but time and again the bomber formation adjusted, maintaining a path that kept them just beyond reach. Inside the dauntless lady, the crew worked with mechanical precision. Engineers monitored engine performance, gunners scanned the horizon for the occasional lone interceptor, and the navigator adjusted their path for the return trip. The B-29 was not merely a machine of war. It was a symphony of coordination, skill, and technology operating at the limits of human endurance. Henderson allowed himself a brief glance at his co-pilot. "We've stunned them," he said quietly, a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction in his tone. Indeed, the Japanese had never faced anything like this. A bomber that could carry an unprecedented payload across thousands of miles, operate at altitudes their fighters could not reach, and strike with unerring precision. Meanwhile, Japanese command scrambled to assess the damage. Reports filtered in from ground observers and surviving interceptors. Whole city blocks reduced to rubble, smoke rising from multiple locations. Colonel Takahashi's face was pale, jaw tight with frustration. "They cannot be stopped," he muttered. This is something we have never seen." The mission over Tokyo continued, with B-29s releasing salvo after salvo, each destructive wave emphasizing the futility of traditional defenses. Henderson and his crew remained vigilant, scanning for threats, adjusting course, and ensuring that every piece of equipment operated at peak efficiency. The Superfortress was a marvel of engineering, but it relied entirely on the skill and coordination of the men aboard. As the last bombs fell, the crew felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Below, Tokyo smoldered, and above, the B-29s turned their massive wings toward the return journey, engines roaring in unison. The city had been struck, the defenders had been stunned, and the legend of the floating fortress had been cemented in the minds of everyone who witnessed it, both friend and foe. For Captain Henderson and his crew there was no time to revel in the success. The Pacific stretched before them, and with it, a long flight home, filled with the same dangers of mechanical failure, enemy interception, and exhaustion. Yet, as the superfortresses glided away from Tokyo, a new chapter in aerial warfare had been written, one defined by altitude, speed, and technological supremacy. Section 5. The Long Journey Home. Navigating a hostile sky, with Tokyo shrinking beneath them, the dauntless lady and the rest of the formation began the long trek back across the Pacific. The air was still thin at 30,000 feet, each breath filtered through oxygen masks, each movement deliberate and measured. Inside the pressurized cabin, the crew allowed themselves a brief moment to absorb what they had accomplished. Lieutenant Klein wiped sweat from his brow, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Target was a direct hit, he said quietly, almost in awe. I've never seen anything like it. Captain Henderson nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon for the faintest hint of danger. The Japanese air defenses may have been stunned, but they were not entirely defeated. A single misstep could leave a bomber stranded in the vast Pacific, far from friendly territory. Sergeant Mendoza checked the engines again, ensuring they maintained optimal RPM. Engines holding steady, he reported, though his hands remained tense on the gauges. The Bu-29's Wright R-3350s were marvels, but pushed to extremes, they could falter. Any mechanical failure now could spell disaster. Japanese radar operators, still reeling from the unprecedented attack, struggled to track the retreating superfortresses. Colonel Takahashi paced his operations room, staring at a radar screen that showed nothing but a thinning line of blips retreating eastward. They are gone, but what we have seen will haunt us, he muttered. His pilots returned to base exhausted, defeated by an enemy they could not touch. Inside the formation, crew members exchanged quiet words, their relief tempered by the awareness of the journey still ahead. The Pacific was unforgiving. Turbulence at high altitude, unpredictable jet streams, and the constant threat of mechanical failure made the return flight almost as perilous as the attack itself. Yet, there was a shared sense of accomplishment, the knowledge that they had struck a blow that few thought possible. Navigator Lieutenant Ito studied the map, adjusting for wind and fuel efficiency. Course is clear for the Mariana Islands, he announced, though the thin clouds and occasional turbulence made precision challenging. Every adjustment mattered. They could not afford to drift off course, not with so much at stake, and so many miles between them and safety. As the hours passed, the sun climbed high, and then began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the endless ocean. The dauntless lady moved steadily, engines humming in perfect synchronization. Crew members rotated duties, some monitoring instruments, others scanning the horizon, all acutely aware that fatigue could be as dangerous as enemy fire. Despite the exhaustion, the crew could not ignore the magnitude of what they had achieved. The Japanese air defenses had been rendered almost irrelevant, unable to challenge the altitude, speed, or firepower of the Bu-29. Below, the Pacific shimmered endlessly, a vast mirror, reflecting the late afternoon sun. The Bu-29s glided with steady precision, each mile bringing them closer to the relative safety of Tini. The city of Tokyo had been scarred, the defenders humiliated, and the legend of the superfortress solidified in the annals of aerial warfare. Yet, the mission was far from over. Even as the Mariana Islands grew closer on the horizon, the men aboard the Bu-29 knew that the challenges of mechanical reliability, fuel management, and high-altitude navigation still demanded their full attention. The flight home was a delicate dance of skill and endurance, one that tested the limits of both man and machine. In the cockpit, Captain Henderson exhaled, a mixture of relief and resolve. "We've done what no one thought possible," he said. "Now let's get home in one piece." Section 6. Japanese shock and the psychological impact. While the B-29s traced a steady path over the Pacific, Tokyo reeled in the aftermath of the attack. Ground crews, pilots, and civilian authorities scrambled to assess the damage. The scale of destruction was staggering. Entire blocks of the city lay in smoldering ruins, fire plumes curling into the sky, smoke visible even from miles away. Colonel Kenjiro Takahashi stood silently in the operations room, absorbing reports from his scattered units. The magnitude of what he had just witnessed was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Their altitude, their reach. "It's impossible," he muttered to his aides. "Our fighters cannot reach them, and our guns cannot touch them. How do we defend against this?" For the first time, Japanese commanders realized that conventional strategies would be inadequate. The B-29 was more than a bomber. It was a psychological weapon, a floating fortress capable of instilling fear before a single bomb was dropped. Ordinary morale collapsed under the weight of such an overwhelming technological advantage. In cities across Japan, civilians and local defense units shared whispered accounts of the enormous silver planes seen gliding high above. Rumors spread rapidly: a bomber too high to intercept, too fast to evade, and carrying a payload capable of leveling entire neighborhoods. Even the most seasoned Japanese pilots admitted, quietly, that they had never faced an enemy like this. Back on the Dauntless Lady, the crew sensed the profound effect of their mission. Lieutenant Klein, watching the city recede beneath the clouds, realized that the impact went beyond mere destruction. They had introduced a new reality that America could reach the very heart of Japan at will. Each mile flown back toward Tinian carried the weight of both accomplishment and responsibility. Sergeant Mendoza adjusted the engine throttles, keeping the 4 massive R-3350s within optimal parameters. "We've stunned them," he said quietly, the quiet hum of the engines punctuating his words. "They can't touch us." Even among the Japanese pilots, defeat was bitterly acknowledged. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, after returning from a futile intercept, sat in the hangar, staring at the now silent radar screens. "We were never meant to reach them," he admitted to a fellow pilot. "Their technology, it is beyond our imagination." The words hung in the air, a solemn testament to the new age of aerial warfare. Across the Pacific, American commanders began reviewing reports and photographs taken during the mission. General Curtis LeMay, who had advocated for high-altitude precision bombing, understood immediately the strategic significance. The B-29 was no longer merely a bomber. It was a game-changer. Japanese cities previously considered safe from distant attacks were now within reach. The psychological toll was as powerful as the physical destruction. Japanese defenders faced a demoralizing truth: a relentless technological superiority they could neither counter nor comprehend fully. The B-29 had shattered the conventional understanding of air defense and introduced a looming, almost supernatural presence over Japan. Inside the Dauntless Lady, Henderson allowed himself a moment to reflect. They had flown higher, farther, and with greater precision than any bomber in history. The mission had succeeded beyond expectations, and yet the real battle sustaining this capability, maintaining crews and machines for future raids, was only beginning. As the Superfortress continued its flight toward Tinian, the crew remained vigilant. They knew that the next encounter could bring new challenges, but for now they had carved a decisive mark in history. The legend of the floating fortress was born not just from its technological brilliance, but from the profound shock and awe it delivered to the Japanese defender. Section 7. Return to Tinian, Exhaustion, and Triumph. The Mariana Islands grew larger on the horizon, glimmering in the late afternoon sun. After hours at cruising altitude, the crew of the Dauntless Lady felt every ounce of fatigue pressing against them. Eyes strained against the blinding glare, hands cramped from hours of precise adjustments, and bodies aching from the long hours in oxygen masks and narrow seats. Yet there was a shared sense of quiet triumph. Captain Henderson kept the controls steady, scanning the endless Pacific for signs of danger. The flight back was not without risk. Engine failures at high altitude could prove fatal, and the vastness of the ocean left no margin for emergency landings. But the Dauntless Lady and her sister aircraft performed flawlessly, a testament to both their engineering and the skill of the crews aboard. Lieutenant Foster leaned back, allowing a brief sigh of relief. "I can't believe we did it," he whispered, almost to himself. The scale of the mission, the altitude, the precision bombing, and the evasive maneuvers had tested their limits, yet here they were, still aloft, the hum of 4 engines a soothing constant in the high sky. Below them, the Mariana Islands approached like a green oasis in the endless blue. Henderson guided the bomber in for a smooth approach, watching the airstrip expand beneath them. Ground crews had prepared for their return, signaling with flags and frantic shouts. Even from 30,000 feet, the recognition of homecoming brought a surge of relief and pride. As the landing gear descended with a mechanical whir, the crew prepared for the final stage of the mission. The massive fuselage shuddered slightly as the wheels touched the tarmac, but the landing was smooth, a perfect conclusion to a mission that had pushed the boundaries of man and machine. Ground crews rushed forward, securing the engines and assisting the crew as they disembarked. Inside the operations room at Tinian, officers and mechanics crowded around, eager to hear first-hand accounts. Captain Henderson recounted the journey, the flak, the futile intercepts, and the precision of the bombing. Lieutenant Klein detailed the bomb site calculations and target impact. Each story was punctuated by disbelief and awe. The B-29 had done what no one thought possible. The psychological impact of the mission was felt immediately. The Japanese defenders had been stunned, their air defenses humbled, and the knowledge of the B-29's capabilities spread rapidly among both allies and enemies. For the Americans, the success of the mission reinforced the strategic value of the Superfortress, a plane capable of striking anywhere in Japan from distant bases, reshaping the air war, and forcing Japan to rethink its defensive strategies entirely. As night fell over Tinian, the crew gathered in quiet reflection. Exhaustion weighed heavily, but so did the knowledge that they had participated in a historic moment. Captain Henderson looked around at his crew, faces streaked with sweat and fatigue, and allowed himself a rare smile. "We've made history today," he said softly, "and tomorrow, we do it all again." Section 8. Assessing the damage. Tokyo reels from the assault. As night fell over Tokyo, the city lay in a haze of smoke and fire, the aftermath of the B-29 assault evident across the sprawling urban landscape. Observers on the ground struggled to comprehend the destruction. Streets that had once teemed with life were blackened and shattered, and plumes of smoke rose from factories, warehouses, and residential blocks alike. For many civilians, it was the first time they had felt the true scale of modern aerial warfare. Colonel Kenjiro Takahashi walked the devastated districts near the outskirts of the city, his uniform smeared with soot and sweat. Reports poured in from reconnaissance aircraft and surviving defense units. The bombing had struck with terrifying precision. Buildings gone, infrastructure destroyed, communications disrupted. The young officer whispered nervously. Takahashi's jaw clenched. "This is not a raid of opportunity. This is a demonstration. They are telling us, we can strike anywhere, at any time." The psychological shock on both military and civilian morale was immediate and profound. Air defenses that had been the backbone of Japan's war effort were rendered almost irrelevant. Even the most seasoned fighter pilots, trained in dogfighting and high-speed interception, found themselves powerless against the B-29's high-altitude capabilities. Rumors spread rapidly. Invincible aircraft, untouchable and precise, hovering above Tokyo like steel gods. Despite the devastation, the Japanese military attempted to adapt. Radar posts were expanded, anti-aircraft guns were recalibrated for higher altitudes, and interceptor tactics were revised. But the reality was sobering. The B-29 had changed the equation. Conventional air defense strategies, perfected over years of regional conflict, could no longer guarantee safety. Meanwhile, American intelligence analyzed photographs and reports taken during the mission. The success of the operation confirmed what strategists had long suspected. The B-29 could reach any Japanese city from distant Pacific bases, deliver precise strikes, and return with minimal losses, if flown carefully. The era of strategic bombing over Japan had truly begun, and Tokyo's residents had witnessed its terrifying potential firsthand. For the men of the Dauntless Lady, the knowledge that their mission had reshaped the war's landscape was a quiet victory. Amid their exhaustion, Captain Henderson understood that the real battle was not just in the skies above Tokyo, but in the ongoing struggle to maintain the momentum of this new aerial advantage. Each mission would demand the same precision, skill, and courage they had demonstrated today, with the stakes only increasing as the Japanese adapted. As dawn approached over Tinian, news of the raid's success began circulating among American command. Briefings were prepared, photographs studied, and strategic plans adjusted. The B-29 had not only inflicted physical damage, it had delivered a psychological blow that reverberated throughout the Japanese military and civilian populace. In the aftermath, one truth became undeniable. The floating fortress was no longer a promise, a prototype, or an experiment. It was a weapon of unprecedented power, and Tokyo had been its first proving ground. Section 9. Strategic Lessons. Redefining the Air War. In the aftermath of the first B-29 raid over Tokyo, American command began to fully grasp the implications of their achievement. The Mariana Islands now offered a launch pad from which the Japanese home islands could be struck with unprecedented precision and relative safety. The floating fortress had proven not just its destructive power, but its ability to operate at altitudes where Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft artillery were largely ineffective. General Curtis LeMay pored over reconnaissance photos, pointing at the blackened streets and collapsed buildings. "This changes everything," he said, his voice steady but charged with the weight of realization. "We can strike anywhere. The Japanese defenses are no longer a barrier, they're a warning sign that we have the advantage." Lessons were immediate and clear. B-29 crews needed meticulous training in high-altitude navigation, fuel management, and precise bomb delivery. Flight formations had to be tightly coordinated to maintain defensive coverage, and every sortie would require flawless communication and preparation. The technological edge of the Superfortress demanded discipline, skill, and nerves of steel. The aircraft was powerful, but it could not operate without the men who mastered it. Across the Pacific, Japanese military planners convened emergency meetings. Tokyo's recent destruction had exposed vulnerabilities in Japan's air defense infrastructure. Colonel Takahashi and his fellow commanders debated desperately. New radar installations, higher caliber anti-aircraft guns, and rapid response interceptors were proposed, but each solution faced limitations. The B-29's altitude, range, and pressurized cabins rendered many defensive measures obsolete. The psychological impact of the raid was as significant as the physical destruction. News of invincible aircraft capable of striking any city spread quickly through Japanese forces. Civilians feared the sky. Soldiers doubted their effectiveness, and morale, once a pillar of Japanese resilience, began to falter. Strategic bombing was no longer a theoretical threat. It had become a tangible, terrifying reality. For the American crews, the mission over Tokyo was both a proving ground and a template. Procedures were analyzed, successes celebrated, and minor errors corrected. The lessons of this first raid would guide subsequent operations, enabling the United States to refine its strategy and increase the efficiency and effectiveness of future bombing missions. The B-29 was no longer a test aircraft. It was the spearhead of an air campaign that would redefine the war in the Pacific. Captain Henderson and his crew, now rested and briefed, prepared for the next sortie. Each mission carried greater responsibility, higher stakes, and the knowledge that their actions could alter the course of the war. As reports from the Mariana Islands and Tokyo crossed paths, one fact became undeniable. The era of the floating fortress had begun, and with it a new chapter in aerial warfare over Japan. Section 10. Legacy of the Floating Fortress. A new era of aerial warfare. Weeks after the first raid, the legend of the B-29 Superfortress began to spread across both Allied and Japanese lines. In American military circles, it was hailed as a marvel of engineering and human ingenuity, a plane capable of striking the heart of an empire from distant islands with precision and relative impunity. For the Japanese, it became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that the balance of power in the skies had shifted irrevocably. Captain Henderson sat quietly in the officers' mess, on Tinian, a cup of lukewarm coffee in hand, reflecting on the mission. His crew had flown farther, higher, and more effectively than any bomber in history. They had witnessed the awe and terror that the B-29 inspired in the defenders below, and yet Henderson knew that their work was far from over. Each subsequent sortie would build on this one, refining tactics, improving coordination, and further demonstrating the reach of American air power. The technological innovations of the Superfortress were central to its success. Pressurized cabins allowed crew members to operate comfortably at altitudes that rendered Japanese fighters almost useless. Its range enabled strikes deep into enemy territory without relying on intermediate bases, while its payload capacity delivered destruction previously thought impossible from such distances. Every detail, from navigation systems to engines to defensive armaments, had been designed to maximize both efficiency and survivability. For the Japanese, the appearance of the floating fortress forced a re-evaluation of strategy. Air defense priorities shifted to higher altitudes, intersector design was reconsidered, and the psychological impact on both military and civilian populations had to be addressed. The B-29 was not just a bomber, it was a statement of industrial power, technological innovation, and strategic reach that Japan could neither match nor easily counter. In classrooms and briefing rooms back in the United States, the raid over Tokyo became a case study. Lessons in formation flying, high-altitude bombing, navigation, and enemy psychology were meticulously analyzed. The success of the mission demonstrated how technology and human skill could converge to create a force that was greater than the sum of its parts. For Captain Henderson and his crew, the mission left a lasting impression. They had been part of history, not just witnesses, but participants in a turning point in aerial warfare. The memory of Tokyo sprawled below, the distant flak bursts, and the futile intersections by Japanese fighters would remain vivid for the rest of their lives. The Dauntless Lady and her sister aircraft continued to fly missions over Japan, each raid further solidifying the reputation of the B-29. Enemy defenses were stretched thin, cities became vulnerable, and the psychological edge of the Allies grew. The floating fortress had proven that technological superiority, when combined with discipline, courage, and precise execution, could redefine the nature of war. And so, as the sun rose again over the Mariana Islands, Captain Henderson and his crew prepared for the next mission, fully aware that they were living at the forefront of a new era. The skies above Japan would never be the same, and the legend of the floating fortress would endure, inspiring awe, fear, and respect for generations to come.